bonsoir à tous et à toutes pour cette dernière conférence des Jeudis de l'EPAF. So, welcome to Boris. Boris, I swear not to massacre your name, but I will do my best. Boris REPSHINSKI, and so with a Polish name, but he's a Jesuit. And Jesuit is a plus for this school, plenty full of Dominicans all year long. We have the pleasure to have you as a guest professor for this semester, and we enjoyed living together, studying together, and making research. You are a Jesuit since 1981, if I correct. Then, since 2000, you became a professor at the Innsbruck University, specialist in the New Testament studies. You studied philosophy in Munich, then theology in Nairobi and Cambridge, and a PhD in Chicago. You made also social work in Zimbabwe and Kenya, and you are a regular visiting professor in India, Myanmar, and Vietnam. And in addition, since 2007, you have been appointed as editor-in-chief of
Zeitschrift für katholische Theologie.
And since 2009, you are co-editor of
Innsbrucker Theologische Studien.
Tonight, you will speak with us about From Theology to Entertainment, Joseph between Matthew and the Gospel of James. Thank you very much for accepting this challenge, and we are going to enjoy what you have to say for 45 minutes, plus questions. So, prepare your questions. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for the very kind introduction. I'm happy to be here. I'm afraid the budget did not allow for drinks afterwards. I just hope that the gospel and the proto-gospel of James is going to be entertainment enough for you. Let me begin with telling you a little bit about the picture that you see here on the screen. Not very clear, I'm afraid. It's a picture that is from a church very close to Innsbruck, and it depicts something that looks at first like a presentation of Jesus in the temple, but in fact it is the presentation of Mary in the temple, and that is a story that is of course coming from the proto-gospel of James. It's a pity that Father Georg already left because it's a Cistercian church. Anyway, let me tell you a little bit about what I'm going to do with you today. I will talk a little bit about preliminaries, then I will talk about the Joseph in the Gospel of Matthew, and I will talk a little bit about Joseph in the Proto-Evangelium Jacobi, or the Proto-Gospel of James, or whatever you want to call it, and I will draw some conclusions and see where that leads us. So let's start with the preliminaries. First of all, what texts do we have? The first one is a text of Guillaume Postel, a Jesuit. It's important to me to mention this in this place. Who brought a copy of that from Syria and published it in a Latin translation in 1552. And actually, this text was mainly responsible for making the Proto-Gospel of James so popular in the Western Church. We have, of course, the ubiquitous Constantine von Tischendorf in his Evangelia Apocrypha. He seems to have worked on most of the Apocrypha in his life. Emile de Stricker, this is the text, and also a Jesuit. This is from the Bollandist Institute. This is a text that to this day serves as the major critical text even though it has come under a lot of criticism recently. And we have Gerhard Schneider, which is the volume in the Fontes Christiani, and it comes with a German translation. Literature. You have Sylvia Pellegrini, highly recommended, because she gives a wonderful introduction in the ins and outs of the questions surrounding the Full Gospel of James. You have Jan Grammer, and I was one of the co-editors of this volume on the Proto-Evangelium of James, and it's a good collection of essays that gives you an introduction to most of the problems of the Proto-Evangelium. And most recently, George Servus. It's an interesting thing. Basically, it comes in 2 volumes. The second volume is mostly manuscripts, but he doesn't produce a critical edition. Instead, what he does is he collates a number of manuscripts, among them the most important one, the Papyrus Baltimore, number 5. And the interesting thing there is he produces these texts completely without any cantillation, any aspiration marks or accents. A strange decision to make, I think. And in his first volume, he has the strange notion, well, or let me say it this way, before Servus, there was always the opinion that the text is a unified text, with some earlier and some younger material, of course, but on the whole it's a unified text. And Servus is of the opinion, and tries to show this through redaction and criticism, that the original text of the Proto-Gospel of James is a text concerning the Genesis Maria, and that is predating the canonical Gospels. And subsequently, and this was, according to his description, an orthodox text that was subsequently amplified through 2 major heretical redactions. I think that will be discussed for some time. I'm not convinced. Well, it is a composite text, of course. The date is usually after Celsus, given after Celsus, because he has this text on the doubting the virginity of Mary, and the scholars usually say the Full Gospel of James is a reaction to that. And obviously Origen probably knew the text, so there you have the dates. It consists of the Apocryphon Jacobi, of the Genesis Maria, chapters 1 through 17, the Apocryphon Josephi, 18 to 21, Apocryphon Zachariah, 22 to 24, and then you have an epilogue in 25. As I said, Emil de Stricker, who basically is the authority on this text, he sees a reduction of unity in this text, and Servus did what I just told you he did. So he's trying to shake up things a little bit. We see where that goes. The reception, extremely popular infancy gospel in Eastern churches. In the Western churches, or in the Eastern churches, you have inclusion in liturgies and lectionaries, and about 140 Greek manuscripts. It's extremely unpopular in the Western church, and that has to do with Jerome, because while let me just say PJ, please. While PJ gives you one explanation for the virginity of Mary, namely that Joseph was previously married, Jerome had a different opinion. He talks about cousins, and Jerome was rather influential. And as a consequence, in a sense, the first and later on the Decretum Gelasianum, they put it on the index, and that leads to the fact that we have very few Western or Latin manuscripts. You have, of course, then Armenian and Slavonic and whatever, so there's a lot of languages out there. And only after 1552 you have Postel producing his book and leading the popularization of PJ. Genre, you have infancy gospel, but what's an infancy gospel? Who knows? It's an apologetic work, one possibility. An apologetic work defending the virginity of Mary, maybe. Maybe it's a historia, as some people say, or it is a novel, and you will probably hear some of the novelistic patterns a little later in this talk. Maybe a midrash or a relecture of canonical infancy narratives. My question is how healthy are these genres at all? I mean, to my mind, what happens in PJ is a mixture of all these elements you find represented in the text. So trying to assign a genre, well, if it helps, okay. Joseph and Matthew, next. Joseph holds the narrative of Matthew 1 to 2 together, despite the title of the Gospel that makes Jesus the main persona of the narrative. In chapters 1 and 2, you don't have the impression that Jesus is of any importance. Joseph is the one who drives the narrative. And others appear and then disappear, but Joseph is the one who holds the narrative together. And the interesting thing is that he is not even a character himself. Joseph seems to be described in very formulaic terms, and we will see some of that a little later when I give you the formula that introduces Joseph. Joseph does not speak. He doesn't say a single word in the narrative. Very silent man. He does what he is told to do. By the way, not by Mary, but by God, or an angel. And his own intentions do not come to fruition. There's only one thing he tends to do, that is getting rid of Mary, but that does not happen. So, well, the Joseph formula you have probably in that dream that he has of the angel. You have that to its fullest extent. You have a description of the situation, then you have a command, and then you have a reason for the command, and then you have the fulfillment quotations strewn in. That's one of Matthew's favorites, and then you have the implementation of the command. So what you have is a situation that calls for a command of God, and Joseph is the one doing that. And in Greek, it looks like this: Galathes de Joseph and Poios and Hos etaxen auto. And then you have twice this formula of the angel after the dream telling Joseph, Legon egathes paralabe, so get up and take. And the answer to this is, and he got up and got Mary, in that case, as his wife, and took Mary as his wife. And you have that in 2:20 again. Now, if you look at Joseph at this formulaic character, a character without character, if you want to say so, or a character without characteristics, it it does remind a little bit of the Old Testament patterns of patriarchal narratives, and in particular what Rudolf Pesch called eine alttestamentliche Ausführungsformel. I had to get that in. And what Steve McEvan called a word fulfillment structure. So that seems to be a sort of formula that already is attested in the Old Testament among the prophets, and that is something that is taken up in the Gospel of Matthew. So Joseph is not really a character in the narrative, if you want to say so, but he is an evocation of Old Testament themes. And in this context, you have sometimes the suggestion that Joseph is referring to an Old Testament Joseph, the Joseph of Genesis 37 following. Maybe that is true. I mean, you have the common names, you have dreams that are common to both. Egypt is a motif that turns up with both Josephs. And if this is in the background, one has to say, though, that there is some development or differences are major. First of all, Joseph is called dikaios, just. And people are wondering, what does that mean? I have a very good colleague and friend who wrote his Habitation monograph on the topic of why Joseph is to be called just, and the conclusion he reached after some 300 pages is that Joseph was a law-abiding Jew and Jesus was sitting at his feet learning Torah from him. I see the eyes of Emil getting larger and larger here. Of course, I don't really agree with that, because the law has not been a topic in the Gospel of Matthew so far, and it won't be a topic in the Gospel of Matthew until the Sermon of the Mount, and even not even at the beginning of the Sermon of the Mount, but only in chapter 5, verse 17, and suddenly it turns up out of the blue, if one wants to say so. So, a law of righteousness doesn't seem to be a very plausible explanation for Joseph's righteousness. One of the other explanations, also one that I have been favoring, is what you hear in that story is that Mary gets pregnant by the Holy Spirit, and then Joseph, being just, wanted to separate secretly from her. Now, if he was law-obedient, that separation, that secret separation, would not be part of this law-abiding procedure. What seems to me is Joseph is more characterized as somebody here who does not wish to get in between God's wishes and his plans for Mary, so between God and Mary. Admittedly, that interpretation is also beset with some problems. The biggest problem being, I think, that Matthew is just not at all explicit about why he calls Joseph righteous. But one of the things you can see is how the term righteousness is used in the Gospel of Matthew, and it rarely has to do with Torah obedience. I mean, if you look at the scene of John the Baptist and Jesus at the Jordan, where Jesus says to John, you have to baptize me because we need to fulfill all righteousness. And that's nothing to do with Torah. So I think that might be a hint that the righteousness of Joseph is something to do with his trying to be in accordance with God's wishes. And they turn out to be different. Well, I mentioned already that the Joseph of Matthew is very silent. If you remember the Joseph of the book of Genesis, commands to him, but they are about God's will for this child. While when you look at the dreams of Joseph, the Old Testament Joseph, they seem to be all about himself. Or he interprets dreams of other people. And one should probably also mention that in the Gospel of Matthew, in the infancy narrative, Joseph is not the only one who dreams. The Magi do too. Okay. Now we come to the meat of the talk, I hope. And then I have to refer to my notes again. What happens in PJ? Let's talk about creative imagination. Mary is certainly one of the main interests of PJ's narrative. There can be no doubt about this. But Joseph does figure prominently as well. And this is highlighted by the fact that the chapters presenting the story of Joseph usually take the narrative view or the narrative point of view of Joseph himself. Joseph's representation in the canonical Gospels leaves the figure wide open, I think, for literary development. And this development is unsurprising in that it fills out a number of gaps, for example, left open in Matthew's account. So in this sense, we can talk about a creative imagination in PJ. This is somewhat surprising because it not only develops Matthew's story, but it also decides to leave out a number of things. And this may be due to the fact that PJ develops Joseph's story, but it does not cohere well with some details in Matthew's account. So, the first time the reader mentions Joseph in PJ, he throws away his axe to attend a meeting of Israel's widowers called together by the priests in order to search for someone to take care of Mary. And that's in PJ 9. And a miracle occurs where a dove appears out of his rod and comes to rest on his head. We know that sort of sign. It's at this point that Joseph describes himself as an old man who already has children. It's not clear whether that dove is an allusion to the baptism of Jesus, but somehow the priests interpret this occurrence as a sign of God and persuade Joseph to take Mary into his safekeeping. And this is one of the interesting details of PJ. It never talks about a marriage or anything like this between Joseph and Mary. It's always safekeeping. And Joseph leaves almost immediately. One might suspect that this is a device to keep Joseph far away when Mary gets pregnant. But of course, it's also a sign that this Joseph is a very unwilling guardian of his ward. And so far, we have no parallels at all in the story of Matthew of this kind of Joseph. It contains a characterization of Joseph that is completely new, and it fills in some of the history of Joseph. For example, that he is old and that he has children already. The gap between Joseph's departure and his return is filled with accounts of Mary spinning, being visited by an angel of the Lord, and finally visiting Elizabeth. And among the things Mary is being told is also a prophecy about the future child. He will call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. And that is a direct quote from the Gospel of Matthew. But of course, in the Matthew, that prophecy is being told to Joseph, not to Mary. In PJ, this will be later repeated to Joseph himself, but by then, of course, it's no longer a knowledge exclusive to Joseph. PJ 13 then moves a little closer to Matthew's account. Joseph discovers Mary's pregnancy after his return, but he does not want to divorce or separate silently. He makes a big noise about it. First, Joseph bemoans his fate as one similar to Adam, whose wife was misled by the snake. From these inner torments, he then accuses Mary of having done wrong and forgotten the Lord, and even her protestations to the contrary cannot convince Joseph. In PJ 14, Joseph then tries to discern what to do. He comes to the Matthean conclusion to divorce her secretly, but PJ also details the reason for it. Joseph is not sure whether Mary has sinned or not. The decision to divorce secretly is no longer a result of Joseph's righteousness, but of his fear and his inability to decide what to do. At this point, night overtakes him. And of course, what happens at night? You dream. And of course, Joseph has a dream, and I'll detail this here. It's almost a quotation from the Gospel of Matthew and the angel's annunciation to Joseph, but with a couple of important differences. First of all, Joseph is not addressed by name and Davidic lineage, and that is another feature of PJ. Davidic lineage for Jesus is established through Mary and not through Joseph. The angel identifies Joseph's fear as relating to the child. Do not fear this child. In Matthew, do not fear to take Mary as your wife. The wording makes it clear that Mary is meant, but it excludes at the same time the possibility of normal sexual intercourse appropriate between husband and wife. And this substitution highlights the ambiguous relationship between Mary and Joseph, who constantly refuses to call Mary his wife, and PJ 19 expressly says she is being recognized as my wife, but she is not my wife. But more than this, Joseph's fear no longer concerns taking Mary into his home, rather Mary herself. The shift seems to be subtle, yet significant. It is highlighted by the fact that from now on, Joseph watches over her constantly. The next episode relates to the discovery of Mary's pregnancy by the scribe Annas, who immediately goes to tell the priests. During their examination by the high priest, Mary and Joseph basically assert the same thing. Under solemn oath, they assert their purity from each other, and they have no recollection of the angel and of the dream. They seem to have forgotten about the dream, forgotten about the angel. Doesn't seem to be important. Who knows? Mary also adds that she has no common knowledge of any man. And they have to drink the water of refutation. It's a wonderful little sign. It seems to be some poison, and then they are sent out into the desert. And when they return alive and not dead, it seems that the priests are halfway convinced that they are talking the truth. Not quite convinced, though. But the priests merely state that God has not revealed their sin, He is ashamed to register Mary as his wife, yet to register her as his daughter would be revealed as a lie by the sons of Israel. So that story goes on and on. And so he sets off with her, and his sons, expressing his trust in the Lord. When he is watching her mood swings on the journey, it becomes clear that Joseph doesn't indeed care for Mary, worrying that the child might cause her trouble. About halfway to Bethlehem, Mary's time arrives, and again Joseph exhibits a fair amount of care in finding a place to give Mary the privacy warranted by the impending birth. And then we come to PJ 18, and there's an interesting change, because suddenly the narrative changes to the first person singular. One of the elements that Zeus, by the way, claims to be one of those heretical redactional insertions. It begins with Joseph's search for a midwife. Joseph then reports, and I think this is one of the most beautiful chapters in the whole of PJ. Joseph reports a catalepsy of time and nature. He describes how time stands still, workers seem to be working and not working. Everything kind of comes to this pivotal moment and stops. World history, if you want to say so, stops. The readers might infer that this is the moment of Jesus' birth, but this remains obscure. PJ does not really mention this. But at the end of these passages, Joseph finally finds a midwife and gets her to the cave where Mary is waiting, and then they have this big light, and Ephane Brephos is the text here. The baby appeared. So there is no real birth, it seems, but it's an appearance of that child. And at this point, where we still have the question of Salome coming in there, she's a friend of the midwife, and there's a manual inspection of Mary to prove that she's really a virgin, and that manual inspection is somehow related to the man who is the withered hand in Mark chapter 3. But that's not too important to us, other than being a little bit entertaining, the way it's told. But at this point, at the birth of the child, Joseph disappears completely from the story. He puts in another brief appearance in PJ 21 in the introduction of the Magi, but he plays no further role in the narrative. He's not present at the visit of the Magi, nor does he play any role in the flight before Herod's murderers. His role in the narrative is complete. Creative omissions. We have already talked about the silence of Joseph and Matthew, and that is completely omitted in PJ. In PJ, Joseph is talking all the time, even more than the one in Genesis. And what he's talking to himself, he's talking to others, and mostly what he's talking about seems to be utter nonsense in the direction, or in the direction that the narrative actually goes. So in a sense, this Joseph appears as somebody who is a bit of a comic figure. You know, talking about his doubts, shall I present Mary as my wife? No, she's too young for that. Nobody will believe that she's my wife. Shall I present her as my daughter? No, perhaps not as my daughter, because the Romans will not believe that. And on he goes. In his starting, Joseph exhibits an attitude that shows him mired in doubts. He attempts to refuse the high priest's command to take Mary into his care, and when he finds her pregnant, he laments his failing to guard her properly, and then he begins accusing Mary, and for a while the annunciation of the angel quietens him, but then he talks about his doubts again. Interrogated by the high priest about the pregnancy, he seems to have forgotten the angel's message altogether. So that Joseph becomes a figure who is, one would say, almost a caricature. A further omission is Joseph's righteousness. In PJ, Joseph is never called just or righteous at all. Now that maybe it's not that significant, because in PJ righteousness doesn't seem to play a large role. Joseph in PJ does not exhibit any of the qualities necessary to claim to be just. In fact, he seems to be bumbling most of the time. We do not know exactly whether this is indeed a law-observant man. This doesn't seem to be playing a role in PJ at all, even though the Jewish background of PJ, especially with Mary, is extremely strong and wrong. But it's strongly sort of advertised in this writing. If Matthew's Joseph is just because he's merciful, that trait also disappears in PJ. So this whole just issue is, or righteousness issue, is something that does not play a role in PJ. Some conclusions may also be drawn with regard to Joseph the dreamer. The Matthean Joseph was a man of dreams. Joseph in PJ has only one dream, and that dream he forgets rather quickly. And it is a dream that is exactly the same dream, or almost exactly the same dream, that Mary has before Joseph. So that the dream of Joseph seems to be somewhat superfluous, if you want to say so, for the narrative. Now, what do we learn from all this? Oh, maybe one more thing I should mention is the Davidic descent is not an issue for PJ, and the flight to Egypt, of course, that is something that doesn't even take place. What we can sort of, or if we can summarize this, is that Joseph appears in PJ as a person with a lot more traits than in the Gospel of Matthew. He also, on occasion, appears as a funny person. But what PJ does, and I think it does it very successfully, is it creates for itself the freedom to develop a figure who is much more lively, much more engaging perhaps, and in many ways very much down to earth. The result is that PJ presents a narrative character who is far removed from Matthew's Joseph, even if phrases, quotations, and even situations are reminiscences of the Matthean Joseph. And it is, I think, at this point that the flight from Herod's pillars is revealed. PJ no longer needs Joseph for this. Instead, he is creating a story in which Mary takes the initiative and meets up with Elizabeth again, and this finally sets the stage for the murder of Zacharias and the end of the narrative. For such an ending, Joseph proves to be too much of a burden, and PJ already abandoned him long before, ready to go to Judea and never arriving anywhere. And if this account now has maybe piqued your interest a little bit, there's a new movie on Netflix about, the Netflix movie is called Maria. It has a wonderful performance of Anthony Hopkins as Herodes. So along for that, it's worth visiting. But that tells the story of Mary according to the Proto-Gospel of James. So if you're interested in that, there's a lot of details in there, including that young Mary is stitching on the temple curtain and embroidering it. So anyway, despite Anthony Hopkins, the movie is not very good. So, what do we learn from this? Conclusions. From theology to entertainment. Matthew keeps a tight literary control over his portrayal of Jesus. A repetition of patterns of dreams leading Joseph to an obedience that follows the commands to the letter. It is consistent in that Joseph never questions or discusses the instruction he is given. His main function, so it seems, is to listen to the voice of the angel in dreams and then execute the instructions. And this has several consequences for the narrative. While Joseph is one of the main characters of the Matthean infancy narrative, he's also a rather boring character. He does not hold the reader's attention, or perhaps formulated slightly differently. He channels the reader's attention to the content of his dreams rather than to his person. Joseph in Matthew is a literary construct who is, in terms of literary analysis, according to the Aristotelian model, a flat character. In more modern analysis of characters in the literature of antiquity, Joseph is an opaque agent rather than a complex character. We never hear of Joseph's inner thoughts or motivations, even his actions are not complicated. If Matthew is indeed interested in scaling down the character of Joseph, he achieves two things that seem crucial to the whole gospel. On the one hand, Joseph becomes an idealized follower of God's commandments. His perfect obedience foreshadows Jesus' own obedience, that is, an obedience to the cross. In a sense, then, Matthew's Joseph is already modeling what Jesus will try to teach his followers about discipleship as service and obedience. Matthew achieves this by reducing the Old Testament narratives about divine command and human obedience into the bare bones of Joseph's dreams and obedience. But there is a second notable element. In the first dream, Joseph is told that he should take Mary as his wife and that she will bear a son who then should be named Jesus. Joseph does all these things unquestioningly, but there is one prophecy of the angel that remains unfulfilled, that Jesus will save his people from their sins. Obviously, Joseph cannot obey this particular prophecy of the angel, but as it is so unusual in the infancy narrative, the readers will pick up on this as the heart of the infancy narrative as a whole. While Joseph is the main agent in Matthew 1-2, the question that dominates these chapters, as it does indeed the whole gospel, is how this prophecy about salvation finds fulfillment. The Magi may already While Joseph is not the central character, his development makes for a figure who engages the reader's attention. And the inner and outer meanderings of Joseph draw the reader's interest precisely because they are entertaining and unpredictable. However, such a development of Joseph involves a loss as well. PJ loses the strictly theological focus of Matthean Joseph. There is no pattern of commandment of obedience, and there is no looming question about Jesus and how he might save his people from their sins. So, and with that I come to the conclusion. It may be safe to say that the story of Joseph and PJ carries more of an entertainment value than transports theological developments. But looking beyond Joseph, one wonders, I forgot to, I have no clue where this goes now, but there we go. One wonders whether the interest in entertainment informs other aspects of PJ as well. You could ask whether PJ is an example of popular piety of the time, and we have plenty of examples that show us that in the 2nd century and beyond, lots of adventure stories involving saints and not so saintly figures abound. People seem to be interested in that sort of thing back then. But the question for me is, if PJ is going for an entertainment value, at least in the figure of Joseph, then the question for me, of course, is also, is this a sustainable figure, a sustainable hypothesis for the narrative of PJ in general? And I think one illustration of this thesis should suffice. Is the intention of the episode concerning the manual inspection of Mary by Salome a somewhat funny recreation of the story of the man with the withered hand in the synagogue of Capernaum? Or is it really a statement about Mary's virginity before, during, and after giving birth to Jesus? Or is it perhaps a little bit of both? The popularization of the theory of Mary's perpetual virginity in subsequent generations may be one of the reasons for PJ's immense success in subsequent reception history. But I wonder whether a folk tale became popular theology in later reception, or whether PJ did indeed reflect popular theology in a story disguising itself as a folk tale. That was my question.
Okay, thank you very much, Boris. You took us on an itinerary from theology to entertainment to interrogation of dogma. So you've actually preempted Lukács and posed the first question. But you can't get off that easily, so now you have to answer either your own questions or those of the audience. So who would like to start? There's 3 examples to
Well, thank you very much. I certainly learned some things about the Proto-Evangelium and compared it to the Gospel in a new way now. But it was now. Here's one thing I'm wondering: this disappearance and then reintroduction of the Proto-Evangelium of James in the West. I didn't know about that. Did it become very popular again? Because I wonder, because in the intervening time in the West, people decided that Joseph was young and strong and capable and very competent. But here so would it work to have an old and kind of silly Joseph? Were people just not worried about consistency then?
Thanks for the question. It's an interesting question because it touches on the point of the first slide. That image is an image from an altar in that Cistercian church, and this is an altar which is entirely devoted to scenes from PJ, and has a prominent place in that church. So it's really, and it's only that altar was created only briefly or shortly after Postel's publication. I think one of the reasons why the PJ was, at least in the Western Church, not received so well was the influence of Jerome. And that means with Jerome's explanation of the problem of the brothers and sisters of Jesus in the Gospels, Jerome said, this is a Semitic usage of brothers and sisters. What this really meant is cousins. That is not too convincing, but Jerome was a hugely influential church father, and so that explanation for many centuries became the explanation, and that of course made room for a strapping Joseph in his best years. But of course, I think that's part of the appeal of PJ, is first of all, it fleshes out, Joseph is not the main character in PJ, I told you that is Mary, but it fleshes out a lot of the prehistory of Mary. I mean, PJ is the gospel that tells us who the parents of Mary were. It tells us these wonderful stories about Mary being presented in the temple, the scene of that image, and Mary doing temple things, embroidering the temple curtain, sweeping the floors there, cooking meals, and being holy, and it's those are all stories that fired the imagination of especially a baroque period, and that made PJ a gospel that became very, very widely distributed in Western culture as well. It never reached the point where, like in the Eastern churches, it became part of the liturgy.
Thank you, Boris, for your conference. Very interesting. I found it really interesting, this detail of the scaring Jesus. So, at the end, scaring Jesus. Don't be afraid of Jesus. I was wondering whether this motif is present throughout the narrative of the PJ or in other apocryphal gospels, because I immediately thought of those passages where Jesus kills the other children, so it's scary in a sense. And if this motive of scaring Jesus, it's related to some sort of, it's shaped or reflects some form of popular Christology or theology related to the fact that Christ is the final judge. So maybe people start to be scared somehow. So how do you think of this detail that it's really puzzling in a sense?
Yeah, it is a very puzzling statement. But you alluded to the infancy gospel of Thomas, where little Jesus in the first 3 chapters kills more people than the 3 last chapters. And of course people are afraid of him, and people tell Joseph, keep that boy at home, he just causes trouble. And of course, he does. But even in the infancy gospel of Thomas, it's not the parents that are afraid of Jesus, but it's those who oppose Jesus, or those who slap him, or those who throw mud at him. You know? So there's a little difference there, I think. I find your question interesting. The fear of Jesus. I haven't really thought about this, but one thing I can say is in PJ itself, that motif does not play a major role. It does not return. I mean, popular piety in the first couple of centuries of Christianity is a little bit of a hobby horse of mine. These stories are pretty wonderful, I think. But I have not elsewhere come across this motif. So now that you mentioned it, I might look at that again. Yeah, thank you.
You highlighted the similarities and the differences between Joseph in the Old Testament and in the New Testament. My question is it conceivable that the presentation of Joseph in JP is a deliberate contrast image to the Old Testament? And two distinguishing features I would like to highlight here. First of all, you mentioned Joseph in JP, he doesn't talk very intelligently. That's a contrast to the Joseph in the Old Testament. He seems to be a very talkative and very well-educated talker. And the second distinguishing feature, in the Joseph in the Old Testament, the hand of God is hardly detectable in the whole story, while the hand of God in JP's presentation seems to be rather obvious. So my question, is it possible to perceive it as a kind of contrast image to the Old Testament Joseph?
I mean, the one thing that, of course, always gets you on the track of thinking in this manner is, of course, the coincidence of names. And I think what happens in Matthew is Matthew plays with this, but Matthew plays with a lot of other Old Testament motifs as well. I mean, if you look at the infancy narrative and how it sort of uses but also changes a lot mosaic motives. Moses typology, Dale Allison has called that. I think he's going too far in this, but the motifs are there. Now the question is, or your question was PJ a deliberate reaction to the Genesis Joseph? I don't think so. I think it's more like a playful development of motifs. But as I also tried to show that, I mean, with the Genesis Joseph, you have a very obvious theological development there with that figure. You don't have any development with the PJ Joseph. The PJ Joseph, in that sense, is a very stable character in the sense he remains himself from beginning to end.
As we all know in the international community, what is funny is not evident at all. Sometimes we will say it's not funny. So how do you know if it's funny? How can we know at all if it's funny? And the second question is really connected to that. What can you tell about the author? Because you imagine the author. You say popular culture. Well, can you see it in the language, for example? I've never read it in Greek, so you can connect these two questions and formulate one hypothesis.
Let me start with your second part. language of PJ, the Greek language of PJ is simple. It's not complicated. It's not complicated Greek. But you can say the same thing of Mark, and you can even say worse things about the Gospel of John. So I'm not so sure that the level of language is a good criterion to decide between what belongs to popular piety and what doesn't. One of the criteria, and I think it's not a definition, it's more like a description of what happens in these texts. If you look at them generally, you have a lot of texts that fill in details that are left out in the canonical Gospels. In a sense, I think most of these texts are reactions to these canonical Gospels. For example, what happened on the flight to Egypt? You know, we are only told in the Gospel of Matthew that they fled to Egypt, they spent some time there, and then they came back. But we have wonderful texts to tell us precisely what happened there and how the palm trees venerated Mary on the way to Egypt as she was riding her donkey. Little baby Jesus taking a bath with the son of the person who then becomes the righteous robber on the cross. I mean, those are wonderful stories. That's how we know his name, Gestus. So what you have is this tendency in these texts to fill in information or material that is missing from the Gospels. And maybe we as sort of post-Enlightenment Christians are rather happy that they are left out from the Gospels when we see what comes at us from these texts. But for people in antiquity, or Christians in antiquity, this seems to have been a desiderata to know about these people. I mean, you can't believe how many texts and manuscripts exist telling us about the strangest things about Pilate and his wife, and maybe his centurion who stabbed Jesus with his axe. So there is always that sort of incredible desire to know more than the canonical texts give us. On the other hand, I think it was a wise decision of the Church Fathers to settle on a number of texts as canonical, while not saying that others shouldn't be read also, whether the Gospel. In the case of PJ, it was forbidden, but other texts were read, were told, wonderful stuff, but not canonical, not authoritative. Does that leave you somewhat dissatisfied?
What is fun?
Obviously, your question was funny. But of course, funny or something that's humorous, that is something that happens on an emotional level, and you cannot, or it's difficult to extrapolate this. You only realize this when you tell a joke, whether other people laugh or not. And having been in Africa for 6 years, I told a lot of jokes where nobody laughed. And that's okay. But obviously, some of you found some of this material funny.
Thank you for the talk. Well, it seems serious about the condemnation of the text by Innocent I. Can you expound upon that condemnation? Like, what were the precise points that you disliked about text, because many of the points are good in the text about the virginity of Mary, which is the truth, we all believe in that. And also, there's been many other writers and mystics throughout the centuries who have filled in the blanks, so to speak, like Mary was rather and everything. And lastly, what did other vicars of Christ, successors of St. Peter, say about this text in subsequent centuries?
A lot of questions there. About innocence and the Decretum Velasianum, I think the explanation given there in PJ for the virginity of Mary, namely that Joseph was an old man, coupled with some of these stories where, for example, the Salome inspects Mary Magdalene, she inserts her hand into Mary to feel whether she is still a virgin or not, and then comes out with her hand and the hand is withered. You know, and then she is told, you know, touch baby Jesus and you'll be healed again. And wow, she is being healed again as she does so. I mean, this kind of story, I think, was a bit much for a lot of people. And this is maybe one of the reasons why Jerome was so successful in pushing his own theory about the cousins. But of course, the problem remains until this day. How do you interpret the brothers and sisters that are mentioned in the Gospels? One explanation, Augustine struggled with that, and Augustine came up with this idea of moral virginity. Virginity is something that is at the level of your morality or your ethics, or at a spiritual level, and not something that is necessarily tied to the flesh. This may be one way of going around our difficulties with that particular dogma today. But in the end, basically what I can only tell you is I read these texts and I try to figure out what is actually done in these texts. And when you come then to the question of how these texts are, or how much influence do these texts have on modern spirituality or modern theology, then I am a little bit at a loss because that's not my expertise. What I will say though is that Guillaume Postel's imprinting was hugely successful. He made a ton of money out of this, or the Jesuits made a ton of money out of it. That was rather successful. So and I think it feeds the need of people to know more. And I don't know whether you ever heard of Adrienne von Speyer. She was the great inspiration to Hans Urs von Balthasar, a very famous German theologian. She did precisely that with her mysticism, filling in gaps. And of course, people always want to know more, but I'm quite happy to I'm quite happy with the sometimes soberness or sobriety of the biblical texts that we have, especially in the New Testament.
We have time for one more question.
I have two things. One is about the fear of Jesus. If I remember well, it was written 10 paida, not 10 paida, or am I mistaken?
Yeah, 10 paida.
So it has nothing to do with the fear of Jesus. It has to do with the fear of Mary being pregnant. Then the second thing is about the adelphoi. I say always adelphoi because we are ethnocentric. The problem about the adelphoi of Jesus is only a problem for European languages, not for most of the languages of the world, in Africa, in Asia, or elsewhere. We have to define the word adelphoi, not the word brothers or sisters. And the word adelphoi has different meanings, either in classical Greek or in Semiticized Greek. And the Of course, the 2,000 Adelphoi were the children of the same father and the same mother, because we are European and we cannot conceive something else. I'm joking. I think it's important. It's important when we deal with this question to see that first we have a problem of semantics and a problem of getting outside modern European languages. Because I'm very surprised by the fact that many modern European languages function differently from most of the languages of the world.
I wouldn't want to make a judgment on modern languages and the varieties. I know a few of them, as the French-speaking brothers here can confirm that one. But I would still say, if you get at the, if you look at it from a narrative point of view, the way these Adelphoi are mentioned in the Gospels, then it's hard to not take them as brothers and sisters. Secondly, I think there is, of course, a large debate about how Semitic is the New Testament Greek and how Semitically influences the New Testament Greek. I mean, this is a never-ending discussion, and I also think it goes a little bit beyond our scope here, especially if people want to go to dinner. But what I do think is that is a discussion that should probably not inform our decision about these Adelphoi and Adelphoi, because what you do is when you take Adelphoi and Adelphoi in that way, as Jerome did in the Gospels, then you basically assume the Semitic influence on the New Testament Greek. And I think that discussion needs to be sorted out first before we come to that issue.
In any case, the solution of Jerome is not how can I put it? It's Jerome held the truth, the solution. At the beginning, he held the solution, which is the solution of the Eastern Church, and the two. I mean, even in the Western Church, it was never defined that the solution wasn't as dogmatic. So the church as such, and the Catholic Church, is perfectly be at ease with the solution of or the narrative from that point of view of PG. There's no problem with that. But the thing is, because going back to the word Adelphoi, already in classical Greek, Adelphoi is larger than in modern European languages, because Adelphoi, if you don't say anything else, in classical Greek, it's either the half-sister or half-brother for Adelphoi, or the full brother. And when you want to be really precise, you have to add something else. So you have other uses of Adelphoi in the New Testament when we talk about the children about the brothers of Joseph from the Old Testament, which include half-brothers and full brothers, or the brothers of Herod, which in fact are half-brothers because we know that through Flavius Josephus. So the word is as such large, whether we do the Semitic background or not. But the Semitic background in the New Testament, in the Greek New Testament, I mean, I don't think it is, how can I put it, sane to deny it. Because when you have worked for years and years and years in classical Greek, and then you come to the New Testament, you see a different world from the semantic point of view. But I agree with you that the last view of Jerome is one of the possibilities among others. Even from the point of view of orthodoxy.
Just one response, because I don't really want to talk about the dogma, because that is not the purpose of this talk, and I don't think it's the purpose of this text either. texts to try to explain this. And obviously, that goes back to New Testament texts who are not, how shall we say, single-minded about this issue, or who are open to interpretation, let's put it that way.
So I think we've seen that it's an entertaining text, but still has the power to generate dogmatic discussion. I want to express our thanks for your presence this year, not just the paper this evening. Also, our thanks to the Catholic Biblical Association that funded your professorship. I invite you all to